There's a floor inside a military base that doesn't exist on any blueprint, any inspection report, any architectural diagram filed with any agency. The elevator doesn't have a button for it. The ventilation system doesn't acknowledge it. Personnel records don't show assignments there. But it's real. I worked there for 11 years. My name is Colonel James Whitaker, retired Air Force, and I'm 63 years old with terminal cancer that's given me maybe 4 months to live. I've decided some truths matter more than consequences. What I'm about to tell you could land me in federal prison for whatever time I have left, but staying silent feels worse than any punishment they could impose. The base is in the American Southwest. I won't tell you which one because I still have family who could face retaliation if this gets traced back too specifically. To anyone looking at it from outside, it's a conventional facility doing classified aerospace work, foreign intelligence analysis, the kind of programs that exist at dozens of bases across the country. Most personnel stationed there spend entire careers never knowing what's beneath their feet. They work on legitimate classified projects on the surface levels and the conventional underground floors. They hold top-secret clearance and think they're working on the most sensitive programs the military operates. They have no idea there's something deeper that makes their clearances look like public access. Getting access to that floor took 3 years of evaluation that was more invasive than anything I'd experienced in 20 years of intelligence work. This wasn't checking if I could keep secrets or if I had foreign contacts or financial vulnerabilities. They were evaluating whether my mind could handle what I was about to see without breaking. The screening included interviews under pharmaceutical influence, compounds that supposedly made deception impossible, while they asked about fears, beliefs, psychological traumas. They did brain imaging while showing me disturbing content to map how I processed cognitive dissonance and traumatic information. They interviewed everyone I'd been close to over decades, looking for any indication I might be unstable under pressure or vulnerable to psychological manipulation. And the final requirement was signing documents acknowledging I could be detained indefinitely without trial, that my constitutional rights were forfeit for the rest of my life if I ever spoke about what I was cleared for. The first descent was 47 minutes straight down. The elevator moved so slowly you barely felt motion, just subtle pressure changes as you dropped through solid rock that had been bored out using methods I was never cleared to know about. The car was small, maybe 4 feet by 5 feet, with walls that were some kind of metal that didn't reflect light properly. Looking at those walls was disorienting because your brain expected reflection and got absorption instead, like the material was drinking light rather than bouncing it back. There was no music, no indicator panels, no emergency phone, just a biometric scanner that verified you continuously during the descent and would apparently trigger lockdown if your vitals suggested panic or medical distress. My first time down, I rode with Captain Morrison, a security officer who'd been working that floor for 6 years. He was maybe 35, but looked older, had that worn appearance people get when they're carrying weight that never lifts. His eyes were what I noticed most. They didn't focus on you normally. It was like he was always looking slightly through you, seeing something beyond present moment. He didn't speak for the first 30 minutes of descent, just stood there watching me with that strange, unfocused gaze, probably evaluating whether I was going to handle this or whether I'd be screaming to abort before we reached bottom. Around 30 minutes down, I started feeling something wrong. Not claustrophobia exactly, more like pressure building inside my skull, behind my eyes, a frequency I felt more than heard, resonating in my chest cavity. It wasn't painful, but it was intensely uncomfortable, made me want to claw at my ears, even though I understood intellectually that wouldn't help, because the sound wasn't entering through normal hearing. Morrison noticed my discomfort. Silence. Complete and total silence that felt oppressive, unnatural. Even breathing seemed muffled, like the air itself was absorbing sound before it could properly propagate. The anteroom was circular, maybe 40 feet across, with walls that looked like stone but felt wrong when I reached out and touched them. The texture was smooth, but the temperature was neutral in a way that natural materials aren't.
Everything has temperature relative to your hand, warmer or cooler, but this material was exactly body temperature, like it was actively matching whatever touched it. The lighting came from nowhere I could identify, just a soft glow emanating from the walls themselves. No fixtures or bulbs or visible sources, just light that existed without proper origin and didn't cast shadows the way light should. 3 doors led out of the anteroom, each requiring biometric verification so comprehensive it took nearly a minute to complete the scan sequence. Palm print, retinal scan, facial geometry, something that I think was chemical analysis of my exhaled breath, and a final component I never identified, maybe brainwave patterns or genetic markers or something else entirely. Morrison led me through the left door into a corridor that curved gently, preventing you from seeing more than 50 or 60 feet ahead. The curve was subtle but deliberate, designed so you never had full situational awareness of the space, always approaching blind corners that could contain anything. Morrison stopped me before we'd gone 20 feet. The protocols were delivered with intensity that made absolutely clear people had died from not following them exactly. Never touch any artifact directly under any circumstances, even if it appears completely inert. Never enter any chamber alone. Maintain constant visual contact with security escort. If you start hearing voices that aren't your escort speaking, report immediately and you'll be evacuated. If you see movement in peripheral vision, but nothing there when you look directly, same protocol, immediate evacuation with no argument or delay. And most critical, if any artifact appears to respond to your presence, activates or changes in any way, freeze completely. Don't move, don't speak, don't even breathe heavily until security assesses the situation and gives instruction. He said 3 researchers had been lost over the decades this floor had been operational. Lost, not killed. Their bodies were never recovered. They simply ceased to exist in ways that suggested they'd been removed from normal space-time entirely. Several others had suffered psychological breaks so severe they were permanently institutionalized in facilities that I suspected were specifically for personnel broken by classified work. And the reason for the strict protocols was that the artifacts
Standing there, looking at that sphere hovering in impossible defiance of every physical law I'd been taught, I felt something I hadn't experienced since childhood. Pure existential vertigo, the recognition that consensus reality was far more fragile than I'd ever understood, that the foundations I'd built my worldview on were inadequate for explaining what I was directly perceiving. But underneath the wonder was something darker. A creeping sensation of being observed, not by Morrison or any physical presence, but by something vast and patient that existed in relation to the sphere, something that perceived me in ways I couldn't perceive it. Morrison must have seen my expression change because he said we were leaving immediately. That first exposure needed to be brief to avoid initial contact being too intense. Back in the corridor, the sensation faded but didn't disappear completely. I could still feel something like an echo of that presence, a weight on my consciousness that hadn't been there before. Morrison said that was normal, that everyone who saw the sphere carried that sensation for days or weeks afterward before it gradually diminished. But some people never fully lost it, remained aware of the sphere even when physically distant from it, like it had established some kind of permanent connection with their mind that couldn't be broken even by leaving its immediate proximity. The second chamber was worse in different ways. Larger space, maybe 60 feet long and 40 wide, with containment units lining the walls, transparent cases roughly coffin-sized, and inside them were bodies, humanoid but clearly not human, preserved in a condition that should have been impossible. These specimens had been recovered from multiple sites around the world, according to Morrison, some found with artifacts like the sphere, others discovered in deep underground chambers that showed no indication of how they'd gotten there or who had placed them.
The beings were tall, maybe 7 feet, with elongated skulls and bone structure that suggested adaptation to different gravity or atmospheric pressure than Earth's surface currently had. Their hands had 6 fingers, their rib cages were wrong, too many ribs or ribs in configurations that didn't match terrestrial anatomy at all. Morrison kept us at the entrance, wouldn't let me approach the containment units on first visit. "These specimens are dangerous in ways you wouldn't expect from dead bodies," he said quietly. "We've had 7 researchers over the years who studied them too closely develop what medical reports call extreme empathic distress. They started reporting that they could feel what these beings felt when they died, not intellectually understanding, but actually experiencing the emotions and physical sensations directly. Terror and agony so intense it left them psychologically shattered. 2 of them are still institutionalized 20 years later, can't function in society because they can't escape what they absorbed from proximity to these specimens." He explained that the current theory was that consciousness or memory could somehow be stored in biological tissue in ways we didn't understand, and that sensitive individuals could pick up on those stored experiences when in close proximity. It sounded like mystical nonsense, except it was being discussed by physicists and neurologists with classified clearances who'd spent years studying the phenomenon systematically. They documented cases where researchers with no knowledge of each other or prior collaboration reported identical specific experiences, describing the same moments of death from the specimen's perspective, same environmental details, same emotional states. Statistical analysis ruled out chance or suggestion. Something was being transmitted from the specimens to human consciousness, and whatever that something was could destroy people who weren't psychologically equipped to handle it. If you've ever felt that mainstream science is missing something fundamental about consciousness and reality, share your thoughts in the comments.
Morrison walked me through 4 more chambers that first day, showing me from doorways and observation windows, but not letting me enter. Each space contained artifacts that challenged understanding in different ways. A crystalline structure that seemed to exist in more than 3 spatial dimensions, appearing different depending on viewing angle in ways that suggested it was only partially present in our space-time. Fragments of materials that analysis showed contained elements that shouldn't be stable, isotope ratios that didn't match anything from Earth's natural processes, and devices whose purpose we couldn't determine but that occasionally activated spontaneously, projecting imagery or sounds that didn't correspond to any known language or cultural reference point. But the chamber that disturbed me most was one Morrison showed me only through a small observation window in a heavily reinforced door. Inside was a circular structure, maybe 15 feet in diameter, configured like a ring or gateway, made of material similar to the sphere, but shaped into stable toroid form. The interior of the ring didn't show the wall behind it. Instead, it displayed what looked like star fields, points of light against black background that shifted slowly, suggesting real depth rather than flat projection. Morrison explained this artifact had been sealed off for the past 8 years after an incident that resulted in 2 casualties and 3 permanent psychiatric hospitalizations. The incident involved a researcher who'd become convinced the gateway was showing him specific locations, places where others like the specimen beings still existed, not dead and preserved, but alive and active. He'd attempted to physically enter the gateway, and his security escort had tried to stop him. Both went through during the struggle. The researcher vanished completely and was never recovered. The escort came back 3 minutes later by objective time measurement, but he wasn't the same. Physically intact, but psychologically destroyed. He couldn't speak coherently, just fragments about vast spaces and geometries that didn't make sense, and eyes that watched from angles that couldn't exist. He lasted 6 days in psychiatric care before his heart stopped for no medical reason anyone could determine. Autopsy showed nothing wrong with him physically. He'd simply stopped functioning, like his consciousness had departed, while his body remained briefly alive. After that incident, protocols changed significantly.
Previously, researchers received comprehensive briefing about artifacts before working with them, but that approach seemed to seed ideas that became obsessions that led to dangerous situations. The new protocol was minimal information, strict need to know, and anyone showing signs of fixation on particular artifacts would be rotated out before obsession could develop into crisis. Morrison said the rotation policy had reduced incidents but hadn't eliminated them entirely. Something about the artifacts pulled at human consciousness in ways that strict protocols could manage but not completely prevent. My 11 years on that floor followed the rotation pattern. 3 months studying the sphere's field effects, then moved to material analysis of fragments, then to documentation review of recovery operations, then back to something entirely different. The rotation was designed to prevent deep connection with any single artifact, but even with rotation, I felt the place affecting me progressively. Dreams started within the first month, not every night, but frequent enough to be concerning. Dreams of cities that used architecture unlike anything human culture had produced, beings that resembled the specimens but weren't quite identical, moving through spaces where physics operated differently than expected. The psychological screening intensified over time. Monthly evaluations became weekly, then twice per week. They were monitoring all of us for what they called cognitive contamination, the hypothesis that prolonged exposure altered consciousness in ways that started subtle but could progress to full break with consensus reality. During my tenure, 3 people were medically discharged for cognitive contamination. They weren't shattered like the Gateway incident's escort, but they'd changed in ways that made them unreliable for continued access. They talked about artifacts as if they were living entities with intentions. They reported feeling connected to the objects even when physically distant. One researcher claimed she could still see the sphere with her eyes closed, that it existed in non-physical space that became perceptible once you'd been exposed, like developing a sense you didn't have before.
I understood what she meant because I experienced it too by the end. The sphere particularly haunted me even away from that floor. I'd be home trying to sleep and would sense its presence, not visually but as weight on consciousness, something vast and patient observing from whatever dimensional space it primarily existed in. I never reported these experiences because reporting meant immediate removal and possible institutionalization, so I stayed silent and maintained appearance of being unaffected, while internally struggling with perceptions that didn't fit any framework for understanding reality that my education had provided. The worst part wasn't the artifacts or even the strange experiences. It was watching other people break and being unable to help them, because acknowledging their experiences validated your own, and validation meant both of you would be removed. Captain Morrison, who'd escorted me that first day, gradually deteriorated over the years I knew him. He'd been down there longer than anyone, almost a decade of daily exposure, and the cumulative effect was destroying him visibly. Tremors developed in his hands. His speech became fragmented, like he was having difficulty maintaining linear thought. And his eyes got that look all long-term personnel eventually developed, like he was perceiving things slightly offset from normal space-time, seeing echoes or shadows of events that hadn't occurred yet, or had occurred in different timelines. Morrison was finally removed in my 8th year. He'd had an episode where security found him standing in front of the sphere for hours, speaking in sounds that weren't any language, not even language-like, just utterances that his vocal apparatus was producing while something else operated through him. When they pulled him away physically, he'd looked at them without recognition, like the person Morrison had been was gone, and something else was inhabiting his body temporarily. Last I heard, he was institutionalized in a facility I suspected was specifically for personnel broken by classified work, somewhere they could be kept isolated and studied. The memory suppression protocols were the other dark aspect I learned about too late. When someone was removed for psychological reasons or became security risk from knowing too much, they underwent procedures described as therapeutic intervention, but everyone understood it was memory modification or erasure. The official story claimed it was voluntary, that the person consented to treatment helping them cope with trauma. But I heard things that suggested it wasn't always voluntary, that people refusing treatment tended to have convenient accidents or develop sudden medical conditions requiring hospitalization in facilities where treatment could be administered without consent. I encountered Dr. Sarah Chen about 3 months after she'd been removed from the program. We'd worked together for 4 years, knew each other well. But when I saw her at a conference, she looked at me with vague recognition and couldn't remember my name or how we'd met. When I carefully referenced our previous work together using euphemisms that should have been obvious, she looked confused and changed subject quickly. Her entire memory of those years had apparently been suppressed so thoroughly that even direct prompting couldn't access it. She wasn't the person I'd known. She was a shell going through the motions of normal life while missing years of experiences that had defined her. That's what they do to people who know too much or who've been broken by exposure. They erase the memories and return them to civilian life with cover stories about medical leave or career changes. But the erasure isn't perfect. I could see in Dr. Chen's eyes that something was fundamentally wrong, even if she couldn't consciously access what had been taken. There was fear there, persistent and nameless, fear of something she couldn't identify because she couldn't remember what had frightened her. That might be worse than remembering, living with undefined dread that has no source. I requested discharge in my 9th year, but it took 2 more years of negotiation before they released me. You don't just leave. You're too valuable, know too much, represent too significant a security risk. They had to be convinced you wouldn't talk, wouldn't have conscience crisis and contact media, wouldn't become a liability that required permanent solution. They evaluated finances to ensure you weren't vulnerable to being bought off. They monitored relationships to verify nobody could leverage you. And they made absolutely explicit what would happen if you violated non-disclosure agreements, consequences that went beyond legal prosecution into territories they didn't name explicitly, but that you understood involved disappearance.
When I finally got approval, I underwent 6 months of decompression protocols, regular sessions with psychologists evaluating whether I'd been cognitively contaminated, whether I showed obsessive fixation patterns, whether I could function in normal society after 11 years seeing things normal people never know exist. I had to demonstrate understanding that my obligations continued indefinitely, that leaving active service didn't grant freedom to speak. The non-disclosure followed me for life, with specific provisions about psychiatric intervention if I showed signs of becoming unreliable about maintaining secrecy. 3 years since discharge, and I still dream about that floor weekly. The sphere hovering, the specimens in their cases, the gateway showing impossible vistas. But more than specific artifacts, I dream about the place itself, those curved corridors, the light that didn't cast proper shadows, the silence that felt oppressive despite no acoustic anomaly. That floor changed something fundamental about my perception. I can't experience consensus reality the same way anymore, can't accept comfortable narratives about human history and our place in universe when I know what's hidden in spaces that officially don't exist. The cancer diagnosis came 4 months ago. Stage 4, inoperable, maybe 6 months maximum. That changes calculations about consequences. What are they going to do? Imprison me for the few months I have left? Memory suppression seems pointless when I'll be dead before it matters. So I'm sharing what I can, knowing it probably changes nothing, but needing to speak truth before time runs out. That floor exists beneath a military base in the southwest. The artifacts there prove technological civilization existed on Earth long before humans, that intelligence has emerged multiple times and vanished, leaving only traces that subsequent species either never find or hide when they do.
The sphere, the specimens, the gateway, they're not alien in the sense of coming from space. They're terrestrial, but ancient beyond anything history acknowledges, evidence of chapters that aren't in textbooks. Share your theories about what else might be hidden in classified facilities and whether some truths are too dangerous for public knowledge. And that floor wasn't the only one. During my years in the program, I heard references to similar spaces in other facilities, other countries, each protecting collections of artifacts that don't fit official narratives. The secrecy is global, maintained through informal coordination among intelligence services that normally compete but apparently agree this particular truth needs staying buried. What I saw there, what it did to me and everyone else with access, that's the real story. Not the artifacts themselves, but what happens to human consciousness confronted with proof that everything you were taught is incomplete at best. Some people break, some get memories erased, and some, like me, come out changed in ways they can never explain to anyone who hasn't seen what they've seen. There's a floor inside a military base that doesn't exist. I've told you about it. Make of this what you will.